Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science. This episode was meant to be about the tale of two Chris's. I'm going to get into that, but it's not going to be in this episode. Quite a lot is happening in the Chris Watts case. There's an uptick in coverage and activity. It sort of started with the release of Cadle's book. Then there's been this documentary on criminal confessions. Another book has been published today, December 9th. There are more movies coming out and more books as well. There's the Lifetime movie coming out on the 28th of January. And then in July, there's another big hitter coming out with another book on Chris Watts, The Perfect Father by John Glatt. I've also got two more books in the Silver Fox series to come out. I'm not going to go into that here, but just to let you guys know what's going on in this particular episode. Remember, we started off with this whole idea of the second version is more horrible, so it must be true, and that was based on the NBC article. Then we went a little bit deeper, and then that was based on the E-Online article, the 5 highlights, which we looked at yesterday. And today I just want to go a little bit further into it, and that's from an article on the Oxygen website, where one of the CBI agents just used the words discarded like trash, and just refers to how the investigators found the bodies of the Watts family on the oil site. This article echoes what was said in the NBC article, just about the fact that the investigators are still disturbed to this day. It was while I was sort of going through the latest news that I just decided I want to there's a lot of things I want to sort of touch on, but because I'm quite familiar with it and because I've done it before, I'm kind of inclined to want to just tick off the boxes and move on to the next thing. And I've changed my mind. I've just decided I want to spend a lot of time dealing with the psychology, specifically this whole narcissism nonsense. I see there are YouTubers bringing it up again, obviously sort of taking feather out of the cap of this other author that is talking about it. I'm very allergic to the whole narcissism discussion, and I want to address it properly. So I'm going to be doing a 4-part series on it. So you can look forward to that. It's going to be quite a detailed a study of it, and if you've got any doubt about my expertise on the subject, you might want to revise that view. So it's not going to just be me waffling about my thoughts on it. I never do that. It's going to be me providing some research from very credible sources, and then providing my insight and interpretations of that, but through a criminal psychology perspective. And that's something that's really missing. You get a lot of people talking about this case, whether it's psychologists or Dr. Phil or whomever, and they just don't have that criminal psychology perspective. They just lack that experience in criminal psychology. One case isn't going to give you insight into criminal psychology. Many will help, but you either have an aptitude for that or you don't, and many people don't. And I've got to be honest, it turns my stomach when I hear about just this whole thing of Chris Watts' narcissism. It literally turns my stomach. It's almost like when you have a particular belief system, and someone comes along with something that is almost like new and like a cult, like just something that is kind of in vogue, and it's very trendy and it's very popular, but it's also very untested and likely to be superseded soon by something else. While narcissism is the fashionable psychology today, in terms of true crime, you used to the favored term for someone who was a despicable criminal used to be a pedophile. Before that, it was, I think, the psychopath. And so these terms come into vogue and they go out of vogue, but they've got very little to do with the criminals involved. I think they are used just because they gain traction. It's nice for the public to hear these strong terms, and they're popular, and people kind of like the shock value. The media also like the shock value of it. It doesn't mean that they're actually accurate. It also doesn't mean they're completely untrue. There is often a lack of remorse in many criminals. That's why they commit a crime, because they are not attached to their victims. There is a lot of dissociation because of the same reason. So there is some truth in some of these notions, which is why they are so sticky. Just a reminder, my book on Patrick Frazee is coming out soon. Those interested in the Watts case should find some value in it, because there are some comparisons to Frazee. There's a lot of intertextuality. There's a whole section actually on intertextuality that I think people may find quite fascinating. Just on the subject of books, my book Two-Face has just gotten its 68th review, which I'm quite pleased about. So it's surpassed my previously most reviewed book, Deceit, on Amanda Knox. And just for those interested, my third most reviewed book is Neverest, with around about 60 reviews. All three of these books have been really, really controversial. And of course, all three of them have not had the benefits that some of the other authors have of publicity and all that kind of thing. So, so if you're interested in any of these subjects, Frazee, Amanda Knox, the Everest 96 tragedy, go and have a look. But of course, I've written 10 books on the Watts case. If you never got a Kindle, or you've never read any of these books, or never read any of my books, consider getting a Kindle this Christmas and taking the plunge. One final thing before we start with today's episode. Thank you to the 112 patrons on Patreon. It's growing really nicely. Thanks for your interest there. By the way, there will be a complement to the coverage on YouTube in terms of the psychology, while I'm going to be going into the, let's call it the light side, the sort of easy glossing over of the narcissism stuff. People listening to it may not think it's glossing over, but it's really not going into it very deeply, and I'm certainly not going to be anchoring all of it to the discovery and to statements as I've done in the books. I'm simply going to be touching on the well-known classic aspects of narcissism, but in some detail, and then explaining why they don't apply and what does apply. But on Patreon, what I'm going to be doing is going a bit darker and more intense, and we're going to be examining the dark triad and how that applies to the Watts case. If you haven't subscribed to this channel, please do. Like, share, leave a comment, and let's get started. Okay, so we're back to criminal confessions. This is essentially the third analysis. It's again not a very deep analysis, just very lightly touching on some of the points raised, this time in an article posted on Oxygen, and more specifically a statement that was sort of made by David Maloney, the CBI laboratory manager at the Denver Forensic Scientific Laboratory. I think that's important to bear in mind, that he's not so much an investigator as someone like Lee or Coda is. He's not so much out in the field. He's more sort of inside the lab, sort of dealing with the samples and the forensic side. So a couple of things just to highlight from the article. I don't think this is news to anyone, but it certainly is just worth bearing in mind that the Chris Watts case is described here as one of the most publicized American murders in recent history. Another way of putting it is it's one of the most high-profile American murders. It's unique in the sense that it never went to trial, like the John Benet Ramsey case, like the Madeleine McCann case. It almost seems as if when when cases don't go to trial, they can sometimes have a life of their own that's even bigger than if they had gone to trial, which is very hard to believe in this particular case. But if you think of the Patrick Frazee case, that case did go to trial, and it's barely made a blip on the Watts radar. There are a lot of aspects in that trial that ought to get people's attention, just in terms of victim blaming. For example, Frazee blamed his fiancée for being an alcoholic and abusive mother. None of that was true, but there are many other aspects that are very, very shocking in that case, and yet it's barely made a blip. I think one of the reasons is the huge amount of social media presence Shanann had, which has allowed us to get into the family. We haven't seen that in the Kelsey Bereth case. The parents haven't given interviews and haven't really wanted to really talk about their daughter. And there are actually very few photos of Kelsey, which makes it hard to get to know the victim in that sense. There's also very few photos of Patrick Frazee, for that matter. Frazee also didn't give a sermon on his ranch porch, so there's that aspect as well. So one of the first things I'm going to highlight in the Oxygen article is this point made by David Maloney from the CBI. He said that Shanann was curled up as if just thrown in, and he's talking about the shallow grave. And obviously, he's emotional from what he's seen. He said it was almost discarded like trash and then covered with dirt. I'm not sure if he's talking about her. It seems like he is, but again, I appreciate the sensitivity to say, these poor people, the way they were discarded like trash, but you are then just admitting that you don't understand the criminal psychology, which is that the reason this happened is because that's how this person felt about the victims. They no longer meant something to him. He no longer wanted them to mean something to him. He had chosen another life. He had chosen what was going to be another wife. He wanted children with somebody else. He no longer wanted his family. So, instead of appealing to this criminal's nature, why are you not showing more care? One should simply see it for what it is that he doesn't care, and the way that the bodies are discarded is showing that. And furthermore, he never intended for the bodies to be exhumed. He never put the bodies where they were with the idea that they would be talked about or whatever. The whole idea was to make them disappear. And I think just something that is really basic is Watts didn't have a lot of time. He had to get to the well site, and he had to complete his mission, and he was sort of running out of time. He had to get the job done that he needed to do in terms of the crime, and he also needed to look like he was on the job in terms of the well site. and so he was juggling a couple of balls. I'm not rationalizing here, I'm just explaining how the criminal psychology works. So he didn't have a lot of time, and he was rushing, he was rushing the burial, he was digging quickly, and he was, all that kind of thing. But if one wants to address, would Watts have otherwise put Shanann's body gently into the grave? I'm not sure he would have. I don't think he felt friendly towards her, and this is something quite well known with people who get divorced, that they don't have good feelings about the spouse that they're leaving. And I recently saw an article on the Daily Mail where a woman whose partner had divorced her, cheated on her, was required to pay him, I think, $7,500, and she gave him that money in coins, and quite a lot of social media treatment there with regard to trying to humiliate him on Facebook with a big post and wearing t-shirts like divorced AF, you know what that means. And so this whole idea that that one is going to get out of the intricacies and obligations of a marriage, and it's going to be nice and sweet and kind. When a murder happens, it's precisely because the person doesn't want to do it that way. They want to not get involved. They want to cut their ties, right? In terms of Bella and Celeste, Maloney said they knew that they wouldn't be able to get their bodies that night. This is an aspect that I think is underestimated, is that people are so kind of fixated on the horrible nature of what's dead, and for me, someone who's a true crime writer, that's like the sort of non-negotiable, obvious initial aspect, is that you say things like, well, it's horrible that this crime happened, the criminal is obviously evil, the crimes are disgusting, this person didn't deserve to die, and all that. That's the thing that's what you sort of register in the first minute, when you hear about the crime. But you still be sort of saying that what was done was despicable. There's no real analysis really involved there. I mean, you're still stuck with the kindergarten analysis if you're saying things like that. And so I think what takes you further into that analysis is if you start saying, in terms of the criminal psychology, it was actually quite clever of Watts to use the well site, something he was very familiar with and that most people wouldn't be. Something that he had access to but most people wouldn't have. Including law enforcement. Even when law enforcement were able to access the well site, they weren't able to do much. They had to get permission to open the hatches, and it wasn't easy to get what was in them. And Watts knew all this, and in this respect he was quite sly and quite clever, and the silver fox aspect comes across there. Maloney also adds that getting them out of the tankers, even when they knew that they were in them, was a very complicated process. And I think it's an aspect that's also just been forgotten about in this case, is that even when they knew where the bodies were, they were in them for a total of 4 days, and during this time, evidence, if there was any, could have been destroyed. This includes physical evidence, but it can also include lots of other things, including possibly chemical evidence, things like fibers, and maybe even certain traces of DNA. The oil had to be washed out and flushed, and that also made things problematic. I also think Watts is quite sly and even quite clever in the fact that somehow he knew that he would get his children through those hatches, and almost everybody couldn't believe that. So in that sense, he also fooled a lot of people. Again, if you fixated on how terrible a thing he did, and was terrible, you don't sort of get to the point where you realize, how did Watts know that he would be able to get them through? Did he measure beforehand? Did he bring a tape measure to the well side? Did he measure the children's heads? I mean, I know he cut the children's hair, but just that aspect is certainly worth thinking about if you're trying to figure out the premeditation. There is an aspect to it that's very uncomfortable. It makes us uncomfortable to get into his mind. But if you really want to be a true crime rocket scientist, you need to start going down that road. Just another point Maloney mentions here is that he says he normally is involved in the excavations, but you'll often find a body that's laid out in a more respectful way. And in the John Benet Ramsey case, you see a body that has got her favorite blanket wrapped around her. In the Amanda Knox case, although the clothes were removed, her body is covered with a comforter, a blanket as well. So there are cases like that, but again, I think to be stuck on how shocking it is missing the point. Is that where someone is putting the victim's body in a blanket, it might be feelings of regret about what happened. It might be shame. It might be certain feelings of residual affiliation that remain. But where you have a situation like this, I think you've got to acknowledge that there are other feelings going on. There may be feelings of shame, the taboo involved in killing your own family, especially where your wife is pregnant and that you were a party to that pregnancy. This family is a family that you consented to at one point, that you participated with, that you loved, and now you've changed your mind, and now you want to hide that change of mind, not only from society but from the new love of your life and the new life that you want. You want it to completely disappear because they're incompatible. You can't have the one life with the other. And so that's the reason Watts has got to make sure that it completely disappears, and that's really what is going on here. And then you had another agent, Kirby Lewis, quite a high up guy at the CBI, and he just sort of mentioned the sense of dread that he had, that he knew what the mission was, that all these people now have to sort of get involved in this very difficult process of opening up the tanks, not just one tank but two, and they knew that what they were going to find was going to be difficult. Not only was it human remains that have been soaked in oil, it didn't matter who it was going to be, it was going to be gruesome to recover, but in this case it's young children, young innocent little girls, and to see that level of destruction of innocent little forms in childhood, one can imagine that being very traumatic. I mean, this whole idea of this black fluid is almost like a literal death that is coating these little bodies, and I think there is something very psychologically vivid about that. And so we have the district attorney also emphasizing the emotional aspect of it, how horrible, he uses the word twice, this thought was of the children in the tanks. And in the episode he refers to, and I quote, looking at those oil tanks and seeing the size of the hatch at the top where their little bodies were shoved through, and then to have to pull them out of that oil, I wouldn't wish that upon my worst enemy, end quote. The only part I want to emphasize there is those words shoved through. What that emphasizes, and something that I think is obvious, but again I think because of our emotional response to what happened, we don't really think further than that. But when you shove something through, it's got to cause physical damage. It's got to cause scratches. It's got to cause some kind of damage. Anything that is shoved through some orifice is going to damage the thing that is being shoved through, and that is what True Crime Rocket Science has asserted all along, that's how Bella got those injuries, and that's also why she has those injuries and Celeste doesn't, or less so. Maybe some of those injuries have been rendered invisible or destroyed, but bear in mind there was skin slippage, so some skin and perhaps bruising has either been stained in a way or maybe altered in a way. The original color of the tissues may also have changed as a result of chemical processes and also because of heat. But the important part just to bear in mind is that this is a possible explanation which I don't see acknowledged anywhere else. It's not acknowledged in the media. It's not acknowledged by anyone in law enforcement, and it's certainly a unique insight unique to True Crime Rocket Science, to this channel. From Agent Tammy Lee, she refers to it's almost this impression that she has from, I guess, looking at the autopsy photos and knowing what is on there, and we'll get to that in a second, is she remembers seeing Cece in her nightgown, and the Oxygen website highlights the fact that this detail seems to still upset this agent with so much experience. And again, it's an emphasis on emotions. It's an emphasis on the sort of sentimental aspect. I understand how that is relative in terms of people. True crime is it involves some of the most powerful things that can happen to people, in terms of betrayal, in terms of the destruction of a person, in terms of pain and all that kind of thing. So all of those human responses are normal, and it's and significant, and so it is also absolutely natural to feel emotional about them and to be triggered and to feel certain feelings, right? But just in the same way that a criminal trial is conducted in a sober way, at some point one needs to have a sober analysis of what you're talking about. One needs to acknowledge that there are emotions, and they are, but one needs to set them aside and say, well, besides that, okay, what is this evidence actually pointing to? And one needs to, in a sober way, concentrate on the evidence and what that reveals. And if people like Tammy Lee and Coda were in the interrogation room and they were getting emotional, they wouldn't be effective interrogators. They needed to become almost friendly with Chris Watts in order to secure the confession. And I think they were quite strong in their resilience and in their ability to, even though he was telling very disturbing things, especially in the second confession, they were able to keep their heads and keep their hearts and goad Watts even further. The weird part is I think there was a manipulation going both ways. I think Watts was also holding his emotions back and that kind of thing. I don't necessarily agree with Tammy Lee in what she says here about the fact that Celeste was wearing a nightgown means that she had just gone to bed. it could also mean that she was about to go to bed. So I understand what she's saying. I differ, though. I'm not sure whether it's a fact that Celeste had just gone to bed, or whether she ever went to bed. It's the True Crime Rocket Science version that neither of the children went to bed, and that this whole thing of them going to sleep for the last time was how they died. They died in their sleep. They died through being overdosed. And that's also that's completely unique to True Crime Rocket Science. Chris Watts hasn't even mentioned it. It's a interpretation based on the evidence and based on the circumstantial nature of this case and some of the statements. It's something also I've not heard on any other channel, also not ever referenced in the media or even by these investigators. Now, what's worth bearing in mind is the Colorado Bureau of Investigation and the FBI, they're not on these shows to tell the truth. And I'm not saying they're not telling the truth, but what I'm saying is they're not here to provide all the facts, which is why they talk so much about the emotions and that sort of thing. They're not really giving you anything that's really worth anything. They're going through everything that everyone already knows, and they're just providing a little bit of color to that, a little bit of their own personal experience and their own feelings about it. And while the public may like that, that's really just the shallowest tabloid version of treating true crime. It's not true crime rocket science, and you would expect true crime rocket science. You would expect very high levels of, interpreting the evidence from these experts and these professionals, but they're not on these shows to do that. I recently listened to a press conference while I was researching the Frazee case, and while I was researching the Frazee case, the reporters were asking the lawyers, it was the first opportunity they had to ask the lawyers about the trial, and one of the questions I think was to Beth Reed, and the question was, why didn't you call Sheila Frazee to the stand? In other words, why didn't you call Frazee's mother to the stand? And what is quite interesting, obvious but also interesting, was Reed's response was, well, we're not going to discuss trial strategy. In other words, it's an admission that while they are all gathered there to thank people and to be quite explicit about things, that there are clearly things that they will not be explicit about. There are clearly things that they will not reveal. And so the thing about not bringing Frazee's mother into the trial, one can speculate why not, and one possibility is that even if she was testifying against her son for the prosecution ran the risk of the whole case being turned upside down by a witness that might turn out to be hostile, or a witness that might want to be protecting her son at all costs, etc., etc., that whole argument. And so for the lawyers not to want to disclose that, I think is intelligent, because by disclosing it, they could actually they could hand the defense grounds for an appeal, and so on and so on and so on. So there is there's a lot of sensitive information in investigations. This idea that everything is just, people put all their cards on the table and it's what you see is what you get, is a deception. As much as law enforcement and justice and true crime is about truth, a lot of the truth in true crime is subtle, and it's not it's withheld from the public. In that same press conference, in terms of the Frazee case, after the verdict, Dan May introduced his team, and amongst the people in his team, he introduced the members of the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, and he said, on camera, he said, he introduced the various members, and he said, I don't know whether they're allowed to talk to the media. And so everybody did talk to the media, a lot of the people involved, and the applicable CBI agents, I think one of them did speak to the media very, very briefly. And I think he made a comment that he wasn't used to doing it. Probably because the CBI do have protocols. You don't discuss these things. Why? Because criminals would also be watching, and they would be learning about what are the techniques, what are these special techniques that they employ, and that they may need to keep a watch out for. That's also the reason. So besides the legalities, there's also the the danger of other criminals learning from the mistakes of people like Chris Watts, Patrick Frazee. So in criminal confessions, they say that Tammy Lee was actually fighting back tears, saying that Cece had just gone to bed. I don't know whether she believes the version that Cece was smothered in her bed, but if we go to the discovery, page 590, and we track to the word nightgown, it refers to, and this was actually written by Tammy Lee. It was part of her evidence gathering during the polygraph, and she said, she got Watts's version, and part of it was that Cece had on a pink nightgown with a drawing of a bird on it, and a nighttime diaper. So Watts, he was telling the truth. He gave a description of what Cece was wearing at the time, and this may seem like a very obvious point to make, but the children are dressed in kind of night clothes, sleeping garb. They've been prepared for bed, right? One thing that they're not wearing is shoes. No shoes were found in the oil tanks. So if Chris Watts has packed his lunch, which he did, and packed a spare set of clothes for himself, which he did, and packed all sorts of containers, if he was taking his children to the well site alive, and he didn't know really what he's going to do with them, then why are they going there with no clothes, no food? He's got food, they don't. He's got a change of clothes, they don't. And it doesn't seem as if they are being taken somewhere with the idea that they're going to be there for very long, in terms of, what about the sun? What about sunscreen? What about a hat? What about proper clothing for the day where they're going? And so people who believe that the crime happened at the well site, I don't know whether they've thought about that. Maybe they've gotten so emotional about how the children were disposed of and how they were actually killed. They haven't actually thought about that aspect. If Watts has changed his footwear possibly as much as 3 times, but at least twice, why wouldn't he have thought of giving the children footwear? If it was a premeditated crime, then why wasn't this aspect premeditated? And wasn't it? If we track a little bit back into the discovery, if we just go up one line, then there's a curious admission also from Watts that he says he got the girls out of the shower, dried them off, put lotion on them, and got their pajamas on. Now, the aspect there that I think is interesting is the putting of the lotion on them. Did he put Vaseline on them? Did he put some kind of cream on them? Bear in mind, again, this is a premeditated crime, and wouldn't this lotion have helped get them through the hatches? And when Watts is putting the lotion on, wouldn't he have thought about that, right? we know for a fact that on Friday and also on Sunday and also even on early on the Monday morning, Watts was very clear of where he was going. We know that he made unusual and quite specific plans to get unique access and early access to Survey 319. So we know what he was going to do. So one wonders, when he put the lotion on, what was going through his mind when he was putting the lotion on both bodies. Now it's possible that what he's saying here isn't true, that he didn't put the lotion on them, but what if he did? And what if that lotion was Vaseline, some kind of petroleum based lubricant that's both a lubricant and also something that's going to destroy evidence? It's something that's going to, if he's touched their bodies but their bodies are covered with this lotion, there's not going to be any trace of him or of his clothing on them, right? I'm not saying that what we're seeing here is accurate. I'm just saying the mentioning of the lotion is certainly interesting. It could also have occurred post-mortem. Even the showering could have occurred post-mortem. We don't know. When we go back even further, just another lineup, Watts refers to when they got home. This is from the party. He says he gave Bella and Cece a shower because they had sand on them. And again, I think this is really interesting because if Watts buried Shanann first, he would have had sand on himself, and so that's a potential way of how he got sand on them just before they were thrown into the tanks. And who knows, there might have been a little bit of sand, little bit of residues maybe in their hair or in their ears or something like that. But he's explaining that it got there through I guess at the birthday party. In true crime, there's always reason for suspicion when you hear about things to do with washing in the middle of a crime. So in the middle of a murder where there's suddenly this important priority to wash something, and this can include anything from vacuuming to doing the laundry to taking a shower to specific items of clothing that need to be hung out to dry. You find it right across the board in high profile true crime cases, that suddenly in the middle of a scenario where someone dies, someone else very close to them is doing the washing. And it's difficult to know what to do with this information in the Watts case because he did the children's laundry anyway. But one certainly suspects that this washing that he was doing, it made sense to commit the murders at home behind closed doors in a secure location where he could also control the evidence. He could also wash evidence, wash the bodies, put different clothing on them, especially in terms of Shanann, change his clothing, wash his clothing, wash the crime scene, all that kind of thing. And we see this playing out vividly and very specifically and over quite an interesting similarity in terms of the time scale in the Frazee case. When he admits to his mistress that he, after committing the crime, washed his trousers, and in that case it was a bloodbath. Okay, and then on page 591, just quickly going to Bella, that she had a multicolored nightgown on that said "Believe," and Watts mentions also in the I guess the run up to the polygraph, just that sometimes the girls get hot but they don't take off their pajamas. And then he would say, sometimes the girls will remove their pajama pants if they get hot. And this again seems like a psychological nod to Shanann, that Shanann removed her jeans and slept because otherwise she would be hot, or she wouldn't be comfortable in her jeans. So can you see how deeply one can go through even just a superficial review of the evidence that just seems like obvious evidence? In terms of the children sleeping, again, like I said, I don't believe they did sleep, but if you go to the discovery, again, this was compiled by Tammy Lee. Chris Watts told her that Bella came out of her room twice because she knew Shanann was coming home, and he said that Bella asked, was Shanann home? And likely that was what the children were asking that weekend. When is Mommy coming home? When is Shanann coming home? And as it got further into the evening, they probably would have been asking that more. And you can imagine how Watts is feeling by this. His own children are wanting to know when Mommy's coming home, and what he's thinking is, Mommy's kind of never going to be in this home ever again. And again, this is getting into his psychology. The children want to see their mommy, and he doesn't. He wants to see his mistress. The children are emotional, and they are attached to their mommy, and they are maybe even more so than to him. I mean, they've been with her for 6 weeks. And there's a Facebook post where Shanann says how the children like being with her when they come home. And you don't know, maybe Watts doesn't like that. Maybe he doesn't like that they are more loving, whatever, to their mother. But on the other hand, he may also think, if their mother dies, they don't need me, they're not going to want me, they're going to miss her even more. And also, that whole aspect. And then there's the other aspect, which is Watts can't wait to spend time with Kissinger. That is why he's doing all of this. Watts wants free time, and he wants leisure time, and he wants the opportunity to be with his mistress. He can't wait to be with her, and his children are an impediment to that, and his children are also an interruption to the emotional narrative of thinking about her and pining for her and desiring her. The children basically interrupt that by reminding him that there's someone else in the equation, Shanann, and he doesn't want to be reminded of that. And so isn't he tempted to get rid of the children first, specifically because he wants to get to Kissinger? It's not a case that he's waiting for Shanann. He's also it's not a case that he's waiting for Shanann so he can commit the crime. He's also wanting to get back to Kissinger as soon as possible. And when does he get back to Kissinger? During that 111-minute conversation. And so who could be in the way of him commencing with that conversation? Well, the children. So there's another reason to get rid of them first. And what else can sort of interrupt that conversation? If Watts is having a conversation and Kissinger said that television was on, well, it is, he's talking to his mistress. Maybe they're getting up to some kind of mischief during the phone call, and he doesn't want the children to interrupt this intimate conversation. It's the last intimate conversation they're going to have potentially, and he wants to kind of preserve it, and he's thinking, the children are kind of going to be in the way. And so it's also entirely possible that the children died in the lounge, where if they were given some kind of medication or an overdose or something in their food while they were having dinner, that while they were sitting in their little couches, that is when they lost consciousness and died. And in other words, not in their beds, and it's not a long distance from the lounge to the basement. Also, there's no line of sight from the front door to the lounge. I've checked that. So it was, with the blinds down, certainly it was kind of a safe place for them to peacefully, in their experience, it would sort of be like falling asleep in front of the television. Meanwhile, Watts was barbecuing on the balcony. He could sort of keep an eye out on what is happening with them, and also kind of have an alibi. While I was barbecuing, where else would the children be if he was barbecuing except downstairs watching television in their pajamas? And I want to sort of wrap this up just by touching on something that has come up quite a few times, personally, I don't understand it. I don't understand. I don't know. I just find it a very bizarre thing to bring up, where people say, why did, for example, Maloney, he says, why would you separate the family like that? And he also says, I don't see how somebody who loves their family could do that. Well, that's your answer. Your answer is he didn't love his family anymore. That's why he did it. That's your answer. That's the criminal psychology. But when he asked the question, why would you separate the family like that? And I think he's talking about, why would you put the children into separate tanks? Why would you separate Shanann and the children? Personally, I don't really understand the question. I mean, my kind of response is, why wouldn't you? In other words, if you buried everyone in the same place or whatever, why would you do that? That's kind of my question, and I'm bringing it in terms of criminal psychology. Why would the criminal do that? And that's something I want to deal with in an entirely separate episode as part of a deeper dive into the psychology. I want to go into the narcissism aspect, but I also want to address a few little aspects in terms of the criminal psychology. And I mean, the obvious one here is you can imagine with these oil tanks that they're loaded with sensors, heat sensors, chemical sensors, water sensors. When certain chemicals are sequestrated through pipes, there are pressure readings and sensor readings. If there's a blockage, it sets off an alarm. If there are grills and grates within the tanks, if something blocks them, or if certain chemicals are needed or in excess, that needs to be addressed. And Watts was at the well site to begin with because there was what is known as a release, and he had to address the pressure gauges and the let's call it the equilibrium in terms of the gases that were being released by these chemical compounds, right? And that was why it was there. So are you telling me that by adding human bodies to these tanks, you're not going to get some kind of fluctuations in the pressures? And so by adding 2 human bodies to one tank, you are just doubling the risk of these readings, of red lights coming on kind of in the control room, right? So it just makes complete sense that you wouldn't put them in the same tanks. I mean, it's absurd in terms of that criminal psychology. It's really weird that you've got people from the CBI actually saying this. So yeah, I don't know if that's clear. I mean, it makes absolute sense from the technical perspective of wanting to dispose of the bodies, which is exactly what Watts is trying to do, to separate them. There are other aspects that I think are worth going into, and I will, and that is the psychology of separation. The psychology of the separation in terms of Shanann being somewhere else for 5 weeks, and the psychology of the divorce, and the psychology of the separation in terms of Watts separating himself from his family in the way that he did, and how that all connects to itself. So I will go into that, but I think that's enough analysis of criminal confessions. Like I say, we've already dealt with it quite extensively. I will be going into one further aspect, but it's more to do with the interrogation techniques, and that is on Patreon, or will be quite soon. Thank you for listening. If you haven't subscribed to this channel, please do. If you haven't joined Patreon yet, please do. There's a couple of tiers there that reflect, just different levels of commitment. One of them, I think, is $20 for a free giveaway. So anyone wanting a free book on Patrick Frazee, well, it's free, but it will also be like that every month. Every month a new book comes out, there will be a giveaway. If you want a book that's not a new release, that's also perfectly fine. It's a way that I can give back to you guys, and but you can also just join Patreon for $1 and get access to quite a lot of the content that is there. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you guys tomorrow with Christopher Watts' What Else Do We Know? Part 3. Thank you for listening.